How to sew the Hang Out the Flags quilt. This is a set of instructions from Amber Makes as part of our Just Charming range. Cutting out. You need to use 77 charm squares for your quilt, or you can use 5x5 fabric squares. For this quilt, we've used the Flower Shop charm square panels from the June, July and August. But you can use any fabric you want to make your quilt, as long as it's 5x5 squares. So cut all the squares out and arrange them. I cut equal numbers from all of the 3 panels, and then I arranged them into groups so that I could see which was which helps when you're laying out the quilt later so that you don't have the same fabrics next to each other. From the July panel, I cut out all the squares from this. I used the print squares for it rather than the flower display ones, just because I wanted brighter colours. But it's up to you. These will be your flags. So just choose fabrics that you think will look nice on the flags that you want to display. Once you've cut out all the flag squares, you now need to cut all the background fabric. The measurements for this are all listed in the instructions. Cut out all the pieces and label them like I've done. I've just clipped them and put a label on because you've got lots of pieces there, and it will help you to remember when you're assembling the quilt which piece is which. Organising the fabrics. Once you've got all of your charm squares, lay them all out flat. It's easier to see them. I just put them on my kitchen floor. The finished quilt has 9 rows of flags. There are 9 flags in every odd row and 8 in every even. Lay them out till you're happy with them, and then pile them up and label them so that you can say which is which. Making the bunting flags. Take the flag squares from row 1 and start by making the first flag. You will need 2 flag rectangles. These are cut from the background fabric. Take 1 flag rectangle and on the wrong side draw a diagonal line from the top right corner to the bottom left corner. I've used a heat erasable pen for this, but you could draw it lightly in pencil. Now take the flag square and, keeping it right sides up, measure 2 1/4 inch inwards from the bottom right corner. Mark this point on the bottom edge of the flag square like I'm doing here. I've just popped a pin in there because I'll take it out in a little bit. Take the marked flag rectangle and place it wrong sides up on top of the flag square so they're right sides together. The bottom left corner needs to be placed at the marked point on the flag square, and the top right corner needs to meet with the top left corner of the flag square. You can see this much easier here if you just follow what I'm doing. Then pin it either side of the drawn line and sew it down the line exactly on the line. Once that's done, remove the pins and fold the edge of the rectangle over so it meets the bottom left corner of the flag square. Fold it and press it into place, and that will hold it neatly to create one side of the triangle. Open it up and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch outside the seam. You won't need these fabric pieces, so you can just put these in your scrap stash. Fold the rectangle back over and press into place to complete one side of the triangle of the flag. Now, take your flag square again and measure 2 1/4 inch inwards from the bottom left corner, and again mark that with a pin. Take the other flag rectangle and on the wrong side draw a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner this time. Now place this marked flag rectangle wrong sides up on top of the flag square like this. The bottom right corner needs to be placed at the marked point, and the top right corner needs to have the top left of the flag of the marked rectangle. You can see them placed like this. Sew together along the drawn line. Remove the pins and fold the flag rectangle over so it's right sides facing with the flag square, and the bottom right corner of the flag rectangle meets with the bottom right corner of the flag square. Press it into place. In the same way as before, open up the seam and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch outside the seam. Fold the flag rectangle back into place and you have completed one flag. Repeat this to make all the flags in exactly the same way. Making the rows. Once you've made all the bunting flags, you can join them together in rows. Let's start by making row 1. Take all the assembled flags from row 1 and 8 vertical sashing strips. So count out the 8 and then put the rest of the sashing strips to one side to use for the other rows in a moment. Making sure all the flags are in the right order, check against your original layout photo if you've taken one. Place a flag at either end and one vertical sashing strip between each of the flags. So you'll have a flag, a sashing strip, a flag, a sashing strip, all the way to the other end. If you lay them all out, then you can be sure you've got them in the right order. So continue doing that, lay them all out, then you can start pinning them together. So you're going to sew these all together in a row. I pinned mine all together first and then sewed them. So take one vertical sashing strip and place it right sides facing with the first flag. Pin it together so that the flag is on the top. I always sew from the top like this because you're actually going to be stitching over the seam of the flag and you want that to stay laying nice and flat. There's no seam matching here, so this is really simple to do. Once you've pinned on one flag, pin on the other. Again, keeping the flag uppermost so that when you sew across that seam, you can make sure it stays lying flat and it doesn't twist as you're sewing it. So pin the whole row together like this and then you can sew it. Or you can pin one and sew one at a time. It depends how you prefer to work. Pin them together at either end just to make sure they line up nicely and then pin them in the centre. But they will fit because you've made them exactly the right size. Now sew the whole row together like this. So you can see that there's a vertical sashing strip between each flag with a flag at either end. Press the seams towards the sashing strip. This will help it to lie flat and also join together better in a moment. Now that's completed row 1. Row 2 is made in a slightly different way. So take all the flags from row 2 and this time you need 2 outer vertical sashing strips and 7 vertical sashing strips. Now the outer vertical sashing strips go on the outside at either end, that's why there's 2 for this row. So you have an outer vertical sashing strip, then the first flag. Then take one vertical sashing strip, place that next to it, and then place another flag. Then another vertical sashing strip, and then another flag. So the vertical sashing strips are between all of the flags and the outer vertical sashing strips are at either end. Pin these all together in the same way as you did with row 1 and then sew them all together. This is row 2, so you can see the outer vertical sashing strip is at the end. This means that the flags won't be all in rows, but there will be alternated. It makes it look a lot better. Now, when you've done that, you can join together the rest of the rows. So all the odd numbered rows are made in exactly the same way as row 1. So there's row 1 that we made at the beginning. Now make row 3 and row 5 and row 7 and row 9 in exactly the same as row 1. All the even numbered rows are made in the same way that you made row 2 with the outer vertical sashing strips. So once you've made row 2, make row 4, row 6 and row 8 in the same way. If you keep the row numbers pinned on them, it makes it a lot easier when you assemble them later. adding the bunting string. To join the rows of flags together so they look like bunting, a bunting string strip is sewn together across the top of each row. In order to get this position correctly, take row 1 and fold it in half to find the centre point of the top edge and mark this with a pin. You're sewing quite a long strip in place along the top of this, so it's easier if you mark the centre of this to start with. Now take one bunting string strip. This is one of the strips that you cut and joined together earlier as detailed in the instructions. You have to join the strips together because they're too long to go across one fabric width. So take that already joined and trimmed strip, fold it in half and find the centre point. Now match up the centre point, place the bunting string strip right sides facing with the top of row 1 and pin it into place at those centre points. Now pin it into place at either end. Keep the labels on again at this point. Until you assemble the whole quilt, you need to keep the labels on so you remember which row is which. But if you've clipped them on, you can just easily move them out of the way. Now pin it, the bunting string at one end and pin it into place at the other end. Make sure it's right sides facing and the strip isn't twisted. Now to make sure all the seams on row 1 stay laying flat and facing the right way, turn it over and pin it into place from the flag side, because that's the side that you're going to be sewing onto place. So all those seams that you've got facing inwards or flat, it's important that they stay like that. So if you sew from this side, you can ensure that they stay flat. So pin it into place all the way along, making sure it fits nice and evenly. Once you've pinned that into place, you then need to pin one horizontal sashing strip into place. Again, this is one of the strips that you've cut and joined together and then trimmed as detailed in the instructions because it's too long to fit across the width of fabric, so it has to be a joined piece. Fold this in half to mark the centre, and then fold row 1 in half again to find the bottom edge. Once you start assembling all the rows, you can mark the centres of the top and bottom at the same time. I'm just showing you it in this way so you can see it in stages. But for future rows, I would fold it in half and mark the top and the bottom at the same time. Now open up row 1 and place it right sides facing with the horizontal sashing strip marking those central marks. Obviously at this point your bunting string strip will all be pinned neatly into place so it won't get caught in the way. Pin it together at either end and then you can pin it between the pins because all the seams in row 1 will pull the fabric up slightly. So to make it fit nice and evenly, if you just pull it gently between the centre pin and the outer pins, you'll be able to get it lying nice and flat. Now sew these together. So there's the bunting string strip across the top and the horizontal sashing strip across the bottom, and press the seams towards the strips. Now you can repeat this with all of the other rows, putting a bunting string strip at the top and a horizontal sashing strip at the bottom. So there's all the rows 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. Number 9 is different. I will show you that in a moment. When you are attaching the bunting string strips, because they have seams in them, try and move where the seams are. So on row 1, have the seam at one end and row 2 at the other end. Because if you've got all of those joining seams on all the same sides of the quilt, it will look a little bit bulky at the end. Row 9 is a little different as it only has the bunting string strip across the top and no horizontal sashing strip below it. Joining the bunting rows. You now need to sew all the rows together in order, with number 1 across the bottom and number 2 and so on. Before you join them together, fold the rows in half to mark the centre points, again because these are quite long rows, in order to get them laying nice and evenly so that the fabric is nice and flat, if you mark the centre points and pin them together at the centre points and then pin them at either end, you will get a more even finish. So fold the top edge of row 2 in half and mark the halfway point on the bunting string strip. Now place the 2 rows right sides facing, matching those centre pins. Pin them together. Then pin them together at either end. It doesn't matter which fabric you have on top, whether it's the horizontal sashing strip or the bunting strip, because neither of them have many seams in them. They both have a joining seam, but not lots of seams, so it doesn't really matter which one is on top when you sew them together. Once you've pinned at the centre point and at either end, pin between those pins, making sure that you adjust it so all the raw edges are matching. Then repeat that to join all of the other rows together, one below the other in the same way. Once they're all sewn together, you can see that you've got that narrow bunting string strip sitting nicely across the top of the flags, and they're all joined together. When I press the seams for them, because the bunting string strip is quite narrow, I wanted it to be slightly raised, so I pressed the seam allowances towards the bunting string strip so they actually meet together on the top of it, and it just gives that string a slightly raised appearance. Adding the border. Take the top and bottom border strips, there are 2 of these, and you will have cut, joined and trimmed them earlier as listed in the cutting out instructions. Make sure those seams where you've joined them are pressed open. Now take the top of row 1 and place the top border right sides facing to the top of the bunting string strip. Pin it into place and sew all the way along. Again, mark the centre points and pin it at either end, just like you did when you joined all the rows together. Then take the bottom border and sew that right sides facing along the bottom edge, again matching ends and centre points, and keep the flags on top so that you can keep those seams stitched and pressed to one side as you're doing it. Then take the side borders. Again, you will have sewn and joined these together, and these are sewn down either side after you've sewn the top and bottom border on. Because the top and bottom borders and the side borders all have seams joining them, try and place them so that the seams are not exactly opposite each other. It just gives it a more even look. So here I'm showing you that you put the side border down the side after you've sewn the top border on, and then it'll all fit nice and neatly. Once you've sewn them in place, this is what it will look like. So you can see the top border and the side border. I've pressed the seams to one side for these rather than open, but that's entirely up to you. And there on the other side, you can see the top border and the side border. So now all of your flags are bordered by a nice clean border, which just gives it a little bit of space and allows the flags to be seen nice and clearly. Adding the binding. Take the binding strips and cut the selvages off them so that you can join them together into one long strip. Now take 2 binding strips to start with and place them right sides facing at the short ends, but place them at right angles, because we're going to join them together diagonally. This reduces the bulk in the seam. So place a little dot where the bottom strip meets the top strip, and then draw a diagonal line from the top left corner down to that bottom right point. Pin the 2 strips together, either side of the drawn line. If you put the pins far enough away from it so that it holds the fabric together, you can then sew it into place without removing the pins as you're sewing. Sew down the drawn line. Once you've sewn it together, press to set the seam, then open up the 2 strips and press the seam open. It's easier to press this seam open before you trim it because you've got more fabric to hold to press open. So that's why I always do it in this way. Press that seam nice and open and flat. Then take your scissors and trim the seam to about 1/4 inch outside the seam. You've now got a nice diagonal seam that won't be as bulky as if you had a straight seam, because when you fold this in half to bind your quilt, the seam will be in different positions. Now do this in the same way to join all the binding strips together to make one long length. Now we're going to use double fold binding for this quilt because it has a more durable edge and leaves a nicer, thicker finish. You can use single fold or double fold, but for a quilt like this I prefer to use double fold. So the binding strip has been cut to the right width for this, so you now need to fold it in half, wrong sides facing and matching raw edges all the way along. It's much better to fold it and press it before you actually sew it to the quilt. To do this all the way along, and then you will have a nice long strip of double fold binding. When you reach the seams where you join the binding strips together, just make sure as you fold and press them that that seam stays laying nice and flat and open and doesn't turn over. And then again, you'll just reduce bulk. So you can see from here that this, by joining with a diagonal seam, the seams are in a different position on the front and the back, which makes it less bulky. So repeat that to fold and press it all the way along. Now on one side of your quilt, you can see I've already quilted my quilt and trimmed the wadding and the backing so it's even. On one side, measure the halfway point and place a pin in there. And now here I'm measuring about 4 inches above it. That's about enough so that you can join the strip together. So pin the strip into place. So we're working from the wrong side, so the backing fabric side of the quilt here, because I want to machine stitch my binding into place. If you want to hand stitch it, then work from the right side of the quilt. But if you want to machine stitch it, work from the wrong side of the quilt. Then pin it into place about 4 inches below that centre point, because that's where you're going to start stitching, because you need to have a little bit of loose fabric when you join it together at the other end. This is why you start stitching a little bit of the way down from the centre. Now making sure the raw edges of the binding strip match up with the raw edges of the quilt. Pin the binding into place all the way around. Just lay it flat, don't stretch it, just make sure it's lying nice and flat. You've got enough binding that there will be some allowance so that you don't have to pull it at all. Just lay it flat, match the raw edges so that you're working, so the binding is right sides facing with the backing fabric side of the quilt. Now when you reach the corner, in order to get a nice neat mitered corner, this is a really good way to do it. So mark 1/4 inch on the binding strip above the bottom right hand corner of the quilt. So you can see that's the bottom, which I marked with the first line, and 1/4 inch above that. Now mark 1/4 inch in from the side as well, and mark that position with the dot. Then draw a diagonal line from that dot to the corner, and we're going to sew along that diagonal line. So just hold that end of the binding in place with the pin. So you're going to sew all the way down, and then pivot at that point, and then sew diagonally to the corner. Once you've done that, and it's all sewn, press it. Now take the binding and fold it upwards so that the edges are all in a straight line, so that unsewn edge of the quilt is in a straight line with the raw edge of the binding, and pin it into place at that corner. Now fold the binding back down so it's all folded on top of each other. That fold at the top of the binding should lay straight along with the raw edge of the quilt, like this. Then pin it into place on that side. You can remove that bottom pin and place it on top. This just holds this corner nice and neatly when you sew it. Then sew it into place, pin it into place first, and then sew that side into place all the way down in exactly the same way. All the way down, and then miter the corner when you reach it in the same way that I've just shown you. Now once you've worked all the way around the quilt, mitered all 4 corners, you now need to join the strips. You can do this by just overlapping them, but I like to join them diagonally. It gives a neater finish. So to do this, you see where that centre point is that we marked earlier on the side of the quilt. On the beginning edge of the binding, mark that centre point, and we're going to trim along it. The reason I leave extra here is that sometimes you get a join in the binding at that point, and it just gives you room to move this join if you want to. So lay the left-hand side of the binding, that's this ending, over on top and mark exactly where it meets the cut end of the right side of the binding. Now open up the binding, because it's a double fold binding, and the little bit that you cut off you can use as a measuring tool. Lay that on top of the binding, because what you want to do is cut the left hand edge, so the ending edge of the binding, so it's longer by the same width as the binding. You can measure this if you like, so you can see that's 2.5 inches longer, but if you use the cut off binding as a measuring tool, you'll know you've got it exactly right. So now you can see, just lay it to double check that the left hand side of the binding needs to overlap the right side of the binding by the same amount that the width of the binding. It makes more sense when you see it like this. Now your binding will fit perfectly because you've cut it to the right overlap. So to join it together diagonally, you do this in exactly the same way as you joined the binding strips right at the beginning. Place the 2 ends right sides facing at right angles. And obviously this is a little bit more fiddly than when you're joining normal binding strips because it's sewn in place. But if you fold the quilt up, it's easy enough. What I like to do is just pin it into place a bit so I can get the points, and then mark where the top binding reaches the corner of the bottom binding, just like when you joined the binding at the beginning. Now draw the diagonal line. It's easy if you've unpinned them to draw the diagonal line at this point. To draw a diagonal line from that top left corner down to that bottom mark. And draw that line in place. This will be your sewing line. Pin it back into place so it's right sides facing with the other end of the binding. I put a few more pins in when I'm doing this because it's already attached to the quilt. It can pull out of place a little bit more easily. So just put extra pins in when you're pinning this. Then when you pop it under the machine, it won't all shift and move, because it's important that this fits exactly, which it will do because you've measured and trimmed it. But when you sew it, just put a few extra pins in. Now sew together down that diagonal line. Once this is done, you can remove the pins, press the seam open and flat, just like you did when you joined the binding strips. Then trim off the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch outside the seamed line. Now fold the binding back together with wrong sides facing. Because you've been sewing and cutting it, it will have moved slightly. So just fold and press it back together again. And you can see it fits perfectly across the quilt. And with that diagonal seam, it looks just like the other diagonal seams that you've joined the strips of binding together. So it will be almost invisible and you won't be able to see where all the strips start and finish. So once you've pinned it back into place all the way along, You can sew it into place, overlap the edge of the seam, the top seam and the bottom seam, and sew it back into place all the way along. Once that's done, you've got a really nice neat join that's barely visible. Now it's time to finish off the binding. So give it a press all the way around just to set those seams. And then, working from the back of the quilt, fold the binding over and press it. Just fold it over to the right and press it, just so that seam is lying nice and flat on the back of the quilt. And do this all the way around before you turn it over. Once you've done it all the way around, turn the quilt over to the right side. Now sometimes I like to top stitch my binding in place, sometimes hand slip stitch it, but for this one I'm going to machine stitch it. And the easiest way to get a neat finish is working from the back like this. So once you turn it over to the front, all you need to do is fold the binding over so that the folded edge of the binding just goes just over that line of machine stitching. Because you've got the double fold, because it's folded over, you haven't got to turn any edges under. Make sure it just covers it. When you reach the corners, you just need to fold these to mitre them. So you see here, I've folded that upwards into a point. And just give it a little press. It naturally does that because of the way you've sewn it in place. Then fold it back down, just tuck it under, and you've got a nice, neat mitred corner there. Because of the way that you sewed it by stopping at the corners and sewing diagonally, it just will naturally form a neat mitred corner. So pin that into place. Again, in the same way, make sure it just covers that line of machine stitching. Because if you do a top stitching working from the other side, you can't always be certain to catch the other end under. By stitching from this side, because the other side is already seamed into place, you know that you will catch the binding into place. Also, by top stitching from the front, you can make sure that you work nice and slowly and keep it straight and close to the edge. So if you look at the back, the corner naturally is mitred as well. Now repeat that around the whole quilt and then top stitch. You can see here that I top stitched very close to the edge. It's caught the stitching on the back and I've got a really nice, neat finish, neat binding all the way around the edge of my quilt. Give it a good press to set the seams. And now your quilt is finished, ready to hang up or snuggle up underneath or use it for a picnic.